What do you get if you add together Wes Anderson, René Magritte, and divide that by Federico Fellini? Then minus Irving Penn. You get the photographer Rodney Smith, according to Grayson Carter, previous editor of Vanity Fair. Now there's a new book celebrating his life and work, A Leap of Faith, curated by Paul Martineau. Smith's early work in Israel and Connecticut was inflected by the Dust Bowl era influence of Walker Evans. Indeed, this work might seem unrecognizable from his whimsical set-piece fashion photography for Vanity Fair and Ralph Lauren that defined his later career. But as this new book shows, whatever his subject, Smith never deferred from that distinct blend of spontaneity and precision and enduring curiosity of the human gaze. Today, we're joined by Leslie Smolan, Smith's widow and creative partner, to discuss this new book. They met in the 90s when she was the director, and still the director of Carbone-Smolan Agency, and she accompanied and discussed with Rodney many of his later projects. She's now the director of Rodney's estate, and she joins me from New York to discuss this new book. Hi, Leslie. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Liam. Thanks so much for having me.
Bit of a departure today for regular listeners. We're talking about photography. We're talking about the publication of a photography book. Big passion of mine, but I'm super excited to be joined by you, Leslie. And I think that's where we should start, to be honest. I think we should start with you and your relationship with Rodney.
Absolutely. He's my favorite subject always. And he was such an interesting person that I wish you and all your listeners had the chance to meet him. So it's really fun to talk about him. I met him in 1987. I was running my own design firm, as you mentioned, Carbone-Smolan, and we've been in business for about 10 years, my partner, Ken Carbone, and I. And Rodney called to introduce himself and show me his portfolio. I asked him to drop it off, and he said, "Oh, I don't do that." And he said that he also did not live in New York. So I said, "Well, you know, if you're ever in New York City and if I'm ever free, I'd love to see you." But of course, I, to myself, said that would never happen because I was much too self-important and busy. It just wouldn't happen. So just as I was about to hang up the phone, he mentioned there was a house for sale down the street. And surprisingly, he knew I was house hunting in Connecticut where he lived. So I said, "Okay, I'll come visit you." When I met him several weeks later, I was stunned not only by his work, but by the portfolio itself. He presented me with a series of beautifully printed silver gelatin prints mounted on archival board. They were slip-sheeted with vellum. He wore white cotton gloves, and he showed them to me very slowly, like one picture at a time. This is the way an archivist would. And it was clear that Rodney and his work were totally different in every way. He was the consummate artist, and I fell in love with his talent way before I fell in love with the man himself.
I'm sure that many listeners of the Written Pages who are partners, if there's a Buellin as their kind of other partners, they'll be very happy with that. But yeah, you've kind of got to the heart of it, and you must have, working at the agency, you must have seen, like you said, you saw a lot of photographers, a lot of artists, and I'm sure you met a lot of artists sort of living and working in New York. But what was it about Rodney's work that really captivated you? You said you fell in love with the work before the man.
He showed me these soul-searching portraits of farmers and migrants, pictures he had taken during a fellowship to Israel, and while he was traveling through the American South. He had just completed one of his first commissions, which was photographing the CEOs of all the various divisions of the Heinz company, the company that makes ketchup. He flew all over the world. They flew him to Ireland, Venezuela, Italy, Britain, Australia, Belgium, making portraits that were in keeping with these images of farmers, but they were nothing like the typical CEO portrait. Tom Wolfe had written Bonfire of the Vanities, Corporate America, and they referred to themselves, and he referred to them as masters of the universe. So you can imagine these people in marble palaces, sitting in boardrooms, and Rodney's pictures were human and intimate. They were naturalistic and beautifully composed. And the prints themselves had this huge range of blacks. So they were just stunning visually. And the annual report that he had just finished for Heinz won every award. It was just so unusual for the kind of work that was being done at the time. And I, like a lot of other creative directors, we were interested in bringing artists into our own work. We were interested in breaking the mold. It was the 80s were a wonderful decade. It was a time of big budgets and clients who were willing to think differently. It was very rich, literally and creatively. So I was really excited to bring him into my projects and hire him for portraits so that they would have the same kind of natural quality that I had seen in these other corporate portraits.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? You can see there's a discernible. So just to sort of give an insight into the structure of the book, you get the sort of long essay by Paul Martineau at the start, sort of details Rodney's life and the themes and the kind of enduring themes of his work. And then you get the plates with some of his most famous pieces before a couple of extra essays, one on the kind of process, the real photographic process by
Rebecca Sim.
And then obviously a short piece by yourself. But you can see within the book, you can see that turn in sort of in his career when he started working with you and with the agency. And that's why I wanted to start with you really, Leslie, because this book it's about Rodney, of course, but it's about you and it's about both of you. Very much about how Rodney's career took this sort of trajectory that ultimately became, I suspect, lucrative, but also it retained his artistic integrity, if you will.
It's interesting you say that because there's often a debate I've had recently whether photographers who work on assignment is the work different than what they do for themselves. And for some people it is. Dennis Friedman was having a conversation with Paul Martineau and others, and that was his premise coming into our talk. But in fact, Rodney always took his own pictures, regardless of the assignment. He would say to me, my allegiance is to the photograph, not to you. And often when I'd send him off on assignment and ask him to do something, he'd do the exact opposite. And then when I saw the photographs, he was totally right. I mean, that was the image. And unlike most people, for him, making the photographs was almost instinctual. He dug down into a very deep place within himself, and he would feel the photograph, not see the photograph. And so that was totally different.
So what kind of person did you meet when you met Rodney, and what kind of person did he not become so much, but how did your relationship sort of shape?
There was just something about him that gave me new energy. That was who he was. He was very psychological. He was very philosophical. I feel like here's someone who kind of understood me, not just as a business person, but as a person. Let's just put it that way. And I think at this particular moment, I was looking for a place outside of the city to kind of to have a different life, right? To take a break from being nonstop, from working nonstop for, 10 years, and building my own reputation. But so when I met him, all of a sudden I got this new energy to take on some new projects. And one of those was the hat book. So his photographs, again, were a lot of farmers, a lot of workers. Most of them had hats as part of their jobs. He liked hats. He felt they completed the figure, the silhouette. And right around the same time, I met a man who owned the Bowman Hat Company in Adamstown, Pennsylvania. He toured me through his factory, which made hats the same way they'd made them since the 18th century. And there were large black machines, almost looking like printing presses, which were dramatically lit by this floor-to-ceiling mullion windows, combing raw black wool by passing it over these huge steel drums. There were clouds of steam everywhere in this place, which was used to shape wool. And it just looked like one of Rodney's photographs. I mean, it had this timeless quality to it. And it was also the antithesis of the hat as an object of fashion, which fascinated me. I asked Roddy if he would be interested in making a book, a self-generated book about this experience of wearing hats, and that hats could be both disguise or something to hide you or call attention to yourself. And he said yes right away. Now, this I learned later was a guy who said no to everything. No was his favorite word. Take that picture? No. Do you want to shoot color? No. Do you want to try digital? No. But he said yes. And we invited a range of authors to join us in writing essays about hats. And we created what we often refer to as the smallest coffee table book. It's only about 6 by 6 inches, so it always ends up at the top of your pile. Hats do complete the figure. It dresses people up, it adds distinction, it finishes an outfit, and at the same time, it makes people timeless. It makes every singular man and every man. And by obscuring heads and faces, the pictures inadvertently become more and more surreal. And this was something that he discovered. It wasn't intentional or intellectual, but he was just like playing with this iconic image of the hat.
It just seems so simple. It's so far away from Rodney in a way, the real kind of grittiness. He was interested in the working man, wasn't he? To an extent, he was interested in the kind of everyman. That's clear, but the kind of grittiness of it, the kind of, like you said, the kind of hellishness of it. At this sort of point in his career, he'd been interested in hats. He'd been interested in the kind of how people dress, and he would be very interested in that later in life. But how it's this kind of self-awareness that hadn't really been in his early work. It was this very consciousness of his own process. If a photographer can ever be, it was a very kind of self-referential picture, I thought. Mm-hmm. The arc that his career went on after that, where it did become very kind of, very knowing, didn't it, to an extent? So far away from what might have defined his work, but it's so self-consciously his own work.
Well, so it's interesting. He, in the book, talks about this a great deal, was that he was born in New York City to his parents. His father was in the fashion business. He actually invented the first fake fur coat called Morgana, which everybody wore. And then he went on to found, with several partners, Anne Klein and Pierre Cardin, and they became very wealthy when Roddy was pretty young. And he thought his parents were incredibly superficial. He thought that they were only concerned with surface, not substance. When Roddy's father got very wealthy, his mother also got ill, and she basically disappeared from his life. She went to her bedroom, she didn't come out for a year. And then in order to appease her, his father basically took her on these cruises around the world and jetting off to the pyramids in Egypt. This is the 50s, this is a long time ago. And they basically left Roddy home. He's trying to really find his own self-worth. And so he's looking to people he thinks are underprivileged, who have hard lives. And he's finding nobility in these people, much more nobility than he finds in his own parents. And so he goes on these pilgrimages, basically, to find these people and look into their eyes. He's got his small handheld Leica, and he's, asking permission to get into a relationship with them. And he said when he was scared of getting close, he'd get closer. Now, what happened in the meantime, unfortunately, is that his father passes away suddenly while Roddy's in graduate school. So here's this man who's larger than life father, who's totally controlling, and you're constantly in this relationship with this great man to prove who you are. And he does it by taking himself out of the succession of moving into the family business. And then his father dies at 57. And so, this really throws him into a tailspin.
How much do you think then, I don't say defined, but how important was that relationship Rodney had or didn't have with his parents to his ultimately artistic career?
Despite the fact that he rejected them, they had a huge influence on him. So his parents were all about aesthetics and how things looked. His mother wanted him to, almost look like he'd gone to Eton. And so she picked a school, Avon Old Farms, which looked like it was right out of Harry Potter. At home, everything was in its place, everything was polished. He grew up with this grand house where there's an army of people who worked every day to keep everything perfectly maintained, including Rodney himself. He was always dressed perfectly for every event. So this sense of order, which he rebelled against his parents, but the sense of order that they gave him as a child was so baked into him, really so much part of his DNA. That's what you see in the photographs, that impeccable aesthetic, this sense of composition, everything in the right place, the sense of styling.
I find that so interesting. Oh, it seemed like to have this very particular view of the world, but to be able to sort of engineer it into a kind of way of representing a sort of timelessness in those photos. And because the hats are very symbolic. They represent, they're kind of like something you'd see in Magritte, which we sort of said. There's something that you would see in the kind of fashion of, the 50s or 40s. But what they kind of do as well is they depersonalize his subjects to an extent. They can hide the gaze. They can sort of manipulate the gaze of one of his subjects. And I can see the picture behind you,
Right.
which is a fine example of, the eyes are being cut off. And when you do that, a person becomes very, very different. It's like when you see, when they're trying to anonymize a person, the thing that they get rid of is the eyes. So
That's right. No, he would often say the eyes are the window to the soul. And when he first started photographing those early portraits, which are so intense, is all about the eyes. It's exactly as you said. And then when he started moving into this world where he was commissioned, he couldn't pick his subjects, right? So that got a little more challenging for him. He always felt he understood people by looking at them through his lens. And the people he picked were people of enormous strength and endurance. And then all of a sudden he's starting to shoot fashion, and here are these beautiful young people who were not typical. So the challenge was, what's he going to do with that, right? And there's an interesting story. I think this is a real turning point for him. One fateful day in 1993, he was shooting a picture of a German model named Annika for New York Magazine. And he typically liked his models and he often picked them. But this girl he did not pick. She was cold, and she didn't connect with him. And yet, when he developed the film, he discovered there wasn't one bad picture of her. Now, this was a shock. The camera loved her, but he thought so much that it was really his relationship with the subject. So from that point on, I think his pictures became less about the individual and more about the story. And this was particularly true with the men, his male models. The stories started to become whimsical and humorous. And so the images were compelling, but in a very different way than his earlier work.
Do you think that sort of said to Rodney about the experience of photography, but also perhaps the experience of life when he didn't have this, or he didn't think that he had this connection with her, but it produced some of his sort of finest work?
I think that he realized that he had a lot more in his toolkit, let's say, than just the key to all of his pictures was location. So he would hunt for locations, or he'd have location scouts. And when he found a location, what's interesting is he wouldn't stay and explore it. He'd run away because he didn't want to ruin the experience of discovering it the moment he was going to take the photograph. Because for him, this ability to be spontaneous is what got him really excited. And he also knew that, if he scouted on one day and he found this fabulous location, the day he showed up, it could be raining, or the light was coming from a different direction, or the wind was blowing. So he had to be spontaneous in his ability to play in the moment and engage his team, his expertly trained team, to pivot, and shift when he did, based on what he discovered at that second. But he definitely knew instinctually where he could make good pictures. So I think that instance with Annika was one of those. It's a beautiful alley of trees, and there's the symmetry and the tonality of the leaves on the ground and the trees and her dress and this bicycle. I mean, it's a stunning picture, and she is gorgeous. People are very attracted to it because she's very attractive, as is the whole composition. And I think that was a big eye opener for him, is I can make pictures that are compelling and sometimes funny, and I don't have to be in love with this person.
Hi there, thanks again for joining me for today's episode. I do hope you're enjoying it. And if you are enjoying it, why not leave a 5-star review on your favourite podcast provider? Over the years on the Rippling Pages, we've had emerging and award-winning writers. And you can help these writers reach new readers by leaving a 5-star review on your favourite podcast provider. No, it's just great to have you here, so thanks. And I hope you enjoy the rest of today's episode. One can only imagine sort of what would it be like to be inside the mind and sort of body of Rodney when he's on a shoot. There's so many kind of things, because it seems there's such an element that needs to be controlled. The result that he wants, and there's a mastery, isn't there? Or it seems like there's a mastery of the subject, but there's also this sense of there's a lot of variables that he doesn't kind of not only not know about, because that's the way it goes, isn't it? But also that he doesn't want to know about, maybe.
So he wore the same pants, the same Brooks Brothers shirt, the same shoes for 50 years.
I can't believe that. I can't believe that. For a fashion photographer, I can't believe
exactly. That. He practiced his craft over and over and over again. And he was a student of Ansel Adams' technique, the zone system, not so much the photographs themselves, but the way to expose and develop film so that it would be perfect. And so his negatives, he wanted to make the world sharper and clearer. Then when he got on location to shoot, it was pure instinct. It was just, he would let go and he would be in the moment, and he would just experience the photographs. So I'd look at one of the pictures. There's one in the book where there's a row of trees. You see that the reflectors that have been painted on the rows of trees in France line up exactly with the highlights in the field. And it is, as an art director, I'm always doing this consciously, can you have this line and this angle line up with that diagonal, etc. So I said to him, did you know that you lined up this line on this tree with this line in the field? And he said, oh, no. That's where I felt peaceful. And so for him, it was the place. Now, if you'd met him, what was fascinating about him was that he was a nervous wreck every day. I mean, he was a hypochondriac. The first time I met him, he told me he was dying. That was literally, hello, I'm dying.
Right.
Yet you look at these pictures, which are calm and serene and composed and beautiful, and you think, oh, the person who took these photographs must be a very suave guy. And he was a fabulous, funny guy, but he again, his nervousness took over, but not when he was taking photographs. So when he was photographing, he transformed.
Because there was some. We spoke a little bit about his parents. And yeah, his father, when he came into money, and his mother she got breast cancer, didn't she?
She did, yeah.
Yeah, and the way that they sort of responded to that was to sort of have these big trips around the world, as you said, and it was the 50s, which it's not really a thing that I guess people did then. And he was left alone quite a lot, and he was left with his.
Right.
But it wasn't his parents that introduced him to photography, was it? It was
Martin. He had this couple that were at the house, Martin and Fritzy, and they became almost surrogate parents for him. When they left on their day off, he went with them. And so Martin was an amateur photographer, and he set up a darkroom in the bathroom, and while he, was in there, and he taught him about photography. So that was his first introduction to photography. And then when he was a sophomore in college, he went to the Museum of Modern Art, and he saw this exhibit, Margaret Burke White, and Stieglitz, and these pictures, and they were so powerful. And again, his father, he had a fight with his father the same trip, and his father came down on him very hard, and he couldn't say anything. He wasn't allowed to respond, but he felt like photography was a way he could scream at the top of his lungs and say what he wanted, and his father would have nothing to do with it. So that was the moment, and he just decided, I can do this. I can be a photographer, and him as the subject. He said therapy saved his life. He really had to come to terms with all these feelings he had about his parents, and his feelings that they thought he would be worthless without them, that he would amount to nothing. And again, not having them around to show, it took a lot of courage on his part to keep going, and channel that sadness and that melancholy into pictures of such joy and exuberance.
Yeah, it's obviously it's sad to hear someone's distress or difficulty, but it's also perhaps uplifting some way that there was something that he found, and that people can find. Anyone can find to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
Can I? Was it a way to? And I'm thinking about those early pictures. So his early pictures, he took him out to Israel and the Deep South, and sort of a kind of, there was a bit more of a rovingness, wasn't there? There's a bit more kind of sort of street photography element, a naturalistic element to them. It's like I said, influenced by Walker Evans and Cartier-Bresson in there, and there is that desire to connect with people. Do you think do you think that was a way of Rodney sort of discovering how to connect with people? Not necessarily trying to connect, but how to connect with people.
Mm-hmm.
Did it give him a language to connect with people?
He was really good at connecting with people. If he met you, he would already have been talking to you about your mother and father and your relationship with them and with your siblings and where did you grow up. And he could have had his own talk show. He was so interested in other people. And I think he was always taking notes and comparing himself to them. He was trying to understand himself, and he did that through trying to understand other people. And if people were in pain, psychological pain, he was so sympathetic. For his students, people came to study with him. His workshops were like phototherapy. People were often crying. And he'd say, these pictures are good. They're good. They're like 80%, but you're a fabulous person. You can get 99% out of this. And, but you got to go deeper. What is it that you need to say about the world? What is it that, what, not traumas necessarily, but what challenges have you had that you need to show the rest of the world to help the rest of the world understand what it means to be human? So this was a constant search for him. And I think it's interesting he studied theology because that was what he wanted. Those were the questions he wanted to know. That's what motivated him. And photography was his way of expressing it.
And all these people, all these subjects are in places that they seem to obviously fit because it's been constructed. But there's also a sense of, via the poses that he makes them do, via the clothes that they wear, via the surroundings that they're in. There always seemed like people in a place that always seemed to be asking, what am I doing here? And for me, that's a very theological
Mhm.
question. Why am I here? Why am
Mhm.
I on this earth? What's put them here? Why are they in this place? And I thought it was a question that really sort of tied into this theological question of Rodney's life.
Mhm. He liked the fact that pictures ask more questions than answer them. So if you're
Yeah.
saying, why is this person here? What are they doing? Are they about to jump? Are they happy or are they sad? He would love that, because he'd say, if a picture answers every question, there's no point looking at it more than once. But it's those pictures that make you come back to them over and over again, which is really a hallmark of his work. Even, the picture behind me of that woman with the hat, I have looked at his pictures now every day for 30 years, and I never get tired of them. It says, you said, what's she doing there? Why is she in the middle of the hedge? How could she even fit between that hedge? And what's her face look like under that hat? How did she get in there? How did she get out of there? What I find fascinating now, and Paul Martineau has really started to do this for me, is the pictures were taken with a certain purpose, let's say, or intent or moment. And now they're starting to take on a life of their own. So he talks about three men with shears. There's these three men in a field which have bowler hats on, and they're holding these large shears. It was originally taken for a ad campaign for a champagne company. It's again one of those images that teeters between funny and ominous. And Paul talks about the fact that, what are these men doing? Are they even men? Are they automatons? And why are those shears so big? And, are they coming for me? And so many of the pictures do that, where you get to bring your own personal interpretation to what do you see in the work and what does it bring out in you?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the exhibition at the Edward Hopper Gallery, but Edward Hopper was very good at that.
It is. They had a lot in common. I think it's the everyman quality. The people are kind of anonymous. They're specific, but could be any man. There's always this quality of light. There's kind of a window light. There's a narrative, and the people are they sad? They melancholy? They're alone. They're with people, but they still feel alone. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels.
One person that came to mind looking through these photos, perhaps I don't say more so than anybody, that definitely came to mind and I thought was sort of visually referenced, either consciously or not, was Cary Grant. There's a couple of images where they look like they could have been sort of taken out of a Hitchcock film, North by Northwest.
Mhm.
And it just felt like, for me, a visual reference to a kind of era that Rodney seemed to sort of really take pleasure from, that kind of smartly dressed man, the kind of 50s, but also that very alienating experience of why is this person in this situation? What are they running away from? Even though they kind of know that they have to want to run away to survive.
He has a number of photographs with planes in them. It's interesting you call it North by Northwest, because that's what Roddy called it as well. It just feels
Wow.
like that Hitchcock moment. He made it look easy. Some of that's because he didn't shoot digital. He was never tethered to a computer and checking. He was, again, because he was so fluid, because he and his group, they could just move. And if it wasn't working, they would move. And he could shoot an enormous amount of film in a day, because it's all a piece, right? It's all his sensibility, his sense of aesthetics, his sense of composition, his technical prowess, and then his ability to let go and have fun while he's making the pictures. So that contradiction of, even Graydon Carter writes about it, it's like still but motion. And in many ways, I think he was one big contradiction. Suave but anxious, stillness but motion, sad but happy. That's what was so intriguing about the pictures, as was the man.
I think this is what its power is. It has such a physical language as photography that other art forms don't have, and that's what it feels like doing this. This has been.
Roddy was somewhat reclusive. He wasn't out there self-promoting. So a lot of people know the pictures, having seen them, but they don't know his name. And every conversation we've been having with the curators and fans and people like you, Liam, which I love, it just allows everyone to deepen their appreciation and understanding of him. I wish everyone could have met him, and obviously that's not possible, but my personal goal is that people learn as much about him as possible, and they are intrigued by those photographs, they're captivated by them, and they want to know more. Ultimately, I think the look of his pictures and the content, that once you know a Rodney Smith photograph, you can always spot it. And that's a very hard thing to do. So we're continuing to have conversations, which is really exciting for me. Our next event will be a conversation between two master curators, Paul Martineau, who obviously wrote the book and has written 10 major books on photography, particularly fashion photography as art. And he's in conversation with David Campany, who's a Brit, on September 27th. They're going to be at the Fashion Institute in New York City. It's a free event. It's open to the public, and they'll be discussing what makes fashion photography art and Rodney's place in fashion photography history. So that's a Wednesday, the 27th of September. And the day after that, there will be a book signing at Staley Wise Gallery in New York City. Staley Wise is in Soho. They are really one of the premier galleries. They work with museums, private institutions, and collectors worldwide to exhibit and represent the masters of fashion photography. So it's going to be really exciting. It's the first New York exhibit of his work. So we're thrilled. It's going to happen right as Fashion Week is being held in New York City. So all of those things are converging.
How exciting. Well, if you're in New York, I bet you wish you could be. You'd get yourself down to that. Rodney Smith, A Leap of Faith, curated by Paul Martineau, with an introduction by Graydon Carter, a long essay by Paul Martineau, as well as an essay on the product of his photographs by Rebecca Senth, and then a small note at the end by the lady that we're joined with today, his creative partner and widow, Leslie Smolan. And it's published by Getty Editions. But for now, Leslie, thank you very much for joining me on the Rippling Pages podcast.
Thank you, Liam. This has been wonderful, a really wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thanks once again to Leslie for joining me on the Rippling Pages. But of course, my biggest thanks to you for listening. I look forward to seeing you again next time.